Hi, welcome to session 2 of the third topic of the semester. We're covering in this third topic the religious utopias in the British colonization of North America. So this is session 2, and we're going to continue discussing now the Protestant Reformation itself. In session 1, we have covered a great deal of material dealing with the introduction, of course, of this topic in regards to the process by which the British are going to establish a series of colonies in North America, and in which the settlers, the founders, if you will, the original settlers of those colonies, are going to be religious communities, religious organizations who were coming to the New World in order to establish what they believe to be ideal societies, ideal religious communities or religious societies that were going to actually retain the original, in most cases, again, most of those settlers, the original elements, the original principles of Christianity as it was taught by Christ, again, during the era, again, during Christ's presence on earth. So again, this is called primitive Christianity, original Christianity, if you will, elements, again, that existed prior to the rise of the Catholic Church itself in 325. So, we also covered in session 1, of course, since we're going to be dealing with this topic of religion, religious studies, if you will, or religious analysis in looking at, again, how history unfolds, for example, the formation of communities in the New World, the formation of colonies. So we also provided an overview of the different functions of religion. We cover that, again, in terms of religion, serving people to provide meaning to human existence, to understand the world around them, explain why things happen, for example, legitimizing rulers is very important. The legitimacy of rulers in the ancient world often came from the religious claims that rulers stated to the subjects, in which they believe to be divinely ordained, etc. Again, and so this is extremely important because this is some of the issues we're going to be dealing with in this topic, particularly how religion serves to legitimize communities, to legitimize rulers, or to remove the legitimacy of rulers whenever the religion changes, and so on. So we covered that a great deal. And also we covered in the first session the background of the Christian Church as an understanding for the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. The Protestant Reformation, once again, is going to be the critical factor in Europe that is going to push people out of Europe to come to the Americas. Again, it is really the Protestant Reformation itself. It was a religious revolution, per se, in which the Catholic Church is going to be shook due to the fact that there will be people that will come, in many cases, from the church herself, with ideas about reforming Christianity. In other words, they really wanted to reform the church. And so we were looking at this background in session 1 as to how is it that the Catholic Church was established in the year 325, again, by Constantine, and how, again, Latin became the official language of the church as it expanded across Europe. And of course, this is going to be problematic because people are not going to really understand, of course, Mass, or they're not going to understand the doctrine. They're not really going to be able to read the Bible that was actually written in Latin. So again, it really, again, was a religion that only the hierarchy, the church hierarchy, the members, again, the administrators, the priests, the bishops, archbishops, etc., the friars, the missionaries, the monks, the nuns, only they could understand, but the vast majority of the people couldn't. And so again, this is going to be problematic. And of course, the cult of the saints, we talked about the cult of the saints, how again the church resorted to this strategy of using the saints and the Virgin for converting the peoples of Europe. And again, over time, again, over the course of the centuries, this is going to pretty much take center stage, the cult of the saints. Something that the Protestants, of course, are going to be very critical of, as they wanted to really return to the original teachings or doctrine of Christianity prior to the cult of the saints, that is. So we also looked at the church involvement in the politics of Europe. There was a deep involvement in the affairs of the European monarchs and legitimizing the monarchs. With the rise of the Holy Roman Empire in 850, again, we see now that all European kings, monarchs, princes, etc. have to be Christian. And the church, of course, is going to be inaugurating the kings of Europe for the purpose of commissioning them to defend the faith, again, to expand Christianity and so on. And so it started to get very much involved in politics and taxes, collecting taxes from those kings as well, and also creating another form of tax, otherwise known as the indulgences, selling indulgences. So we discussed that in the latter part of the first session, the idea of people donating monies again to the church, making donations in various forms, materially, monetarily, and so on, for aiding the church, for aiding Christianity. And of course, in return, people were given a certain guarantee that the church was going to intervene again in heaven for the salvation of that person's soul. So again, over time, the selling of indulgences will become common practice across Europe, particularly in places like Italy, but it was done everywhere else, by the way, all over Europe. And this gave license to a lot of people to, again, just use indulgences as a way of feeling good about themselves, buying salvation, if you will, and not doing any kind of spiritual disciplines or work. So again, we're going to see by the 1400s a European society in decay, in decomposition, just because people were not really, taking on the spiritual path, but rather just, doing good works. So the good works is I'm going to do a good work that will balance out my bad deeds, and in this way I will buy, again, salvation. So again, now it is at this juncture that we now have to proceed to our discussion on the Protestant Reformation itself. So again, from here on, we're just going to now delve into the Protestant Reformation. And once again, the Protestant Reformation was the moment in which in Europe, and particularly in certain places of Europe, by the way, we're going to discuss exactly which those places were. We're going to see people out of the Catholic Church coming out again in protest. That's what they're called, Protestants, because they're protesting, if you will, certain practices, certain teachings, certain ideas of the church itself. And what they wanted was to reform the church, so the church can be stripped down from all those ideas, from all those practices, so the church itself will return to the original teachings, the original ideas, again, of Christianity, as people understood them, by the way. So that's why it's called the Protestant Reformation. People wanted to reform the Catholic Church, which was the Christian church. And in trying to do so, of course, the church is going to, in a way, resist that attempt for Reformation, and of course people are going to simply leave the church in protest in great numbers, and it is estimated that by the 1600s, Europe, all of Europe, will be divided in half religiously, in which half of the population will still remain part of the Catholic Church, yet the other 50% are going to leave the church in protest, and in doing so, they're going in their own way, trying to create a version of Christianity that they believed was more consistent with the original teachings of Christ. Okay, so this is what we're going to do in this particular segment. All right, so let's look at the Protestant Reformation. So the origins of the Protestant Reformation, the immediate, I should say, let me correct that, the immediate origins, because the origins are, of course, everything we discussed in session 1, again, just the Christian church, the development of the Christian church itself. So the immediate factors leading up to the Protestant Reformation goes back to the 1460 with the invention of the printing press. This technological device, which actually is going to be used for the reproduction of texts and the creation of books. So from here on, again, we're going to see that knowledge that was otherwise just written in barks of paper, in scrolls of paper, that had to be reproduced manually by hand, is now going to be reproduced by a machine. Okay, and you can make multiple copies, again, of a single text, and now, again, reproduce that into a number of books. So again, the inventor of the printing press was a German scientist by the name of Gutenberg. And because this device is invented in Germany, therefore, here is where we're going to see the kind of changes that will lead up to the Reformation itself, again, because one of the first texts that was reproduced in vast quantities as a result of the printing press was the Bible itself. And what the Germans are going to do is actually reproduce the Bible and print it, but in the German language. So I mentioned that, again, Latin was the sacred language of the church, and the Bible was written in Latin when the church was created out of translations from other books that were written in ancient languages, if you will. But the original Bible, again, the Christian Bible, the original that was assembled and put together in 325, was actually written in Latin. And it continued to be reproduced manually in Latin for many, many centuries until 1460 and beyond, that we're going to see that by 1460, the Germans are simply translating this text into Latin, and they're going to pass it around and distribute it, if you will, across Central Europe, which is present-day Germany. And now people are going to have access to the message, to the teachings, to the stories, to the narratives of the Bible, and be able to come up with their own interpretation, so to speak. So instead of relying on the local priest for interpretation and meaning and content, because people just didn't know what the Bible said because it was Latin, so now people had a direct access to the text because it was printed in their own language. So this is going to have a profound effect on the peoples of Germany, in that they're now, for the first time, actually analyzing the Bible. They're going to be reading it, and they're going to be experiencing the emotions, the ideas that are contained and they're going to draw their own conclusions based upon their own reading, that is to say. So this is going to lead to, of course, people questioning again what the church was teaching based upon what they were reading on the Bible. Okay, so again, this is extremely important because the printing press is believed to be one of the most critical factors, immediate factors leading up to the Protestant Reformation. Again, it was a revolution of ideas. It created a revolution in the mind, if you will. This technological device, again, that produced books or reproduce books is going to have that profound effect. That is to say, in that this is going to allow for the rapid dissemination of ideas. You know, you can print an idea, then reproduce it into books, and now knowledge is going to start traveling faster and faster and faster, if you will, or ideas, I should say. So the dissemination of knowledge, that is to say, begin to take place at a much faster rate. Okay, so it is here that we're going to see members of the church that are going to be delving into biblical studies in a very rigorous way, and they're going to start now drawing their own conclusions about what the Bible intended to say versus what the church doctrine actually was saying at this time. And of course, one of those individuals that is coming from the church itself was a German Catholic monk by the name of Martin Luther. He was a scholar, he was a biblical scholar, he was a Catholic university professor, by the way. So he's coming from within the institution, so he's not like an outside critic. That is what I'm trying to say. So he's not outside of the church and criticizing the church from afar, but rather from within. And so during his studies of the Bible, his reading of the Bible, he's going to be studying particularly what the Bible had to say about salvation. Okay, about salvation itself. How does one soul is saved so it enters the heavenly world after death? Okay, Europeans during this time, and for many, many centuries, by the way, were very, very concerned about the destiny of the soul after death. Where is the soul going to go? Okay, is my soul going to go to heaven, or is it going to go to hell? And for a lot of people, that was a very traumatic, if you will, issue that caused anxiety for many, guilt among many as well. And so many Europeans were relying on the answers, on the direction, on the guidance of the church in order to know what was really, again, what people needed to do, human beings needed to do here on earth in order to gain access to heaven after death, gain salvation, and not damnation, because damnation is the opposite, is, going to hell, a place of torment and so on and so forth for eternity. So again, imagine, just the thought that you can go to hell, I'm sorry, and suffer for eternity. That was very, very, traumatic, psychological trauma for a lot of people, just to be dwelling on that thought. That is to say, the kind of anxiety that people live with, and the anguish, and the guilt, because when people feel that they have done certain wrongful acts, they feel guilty about that, and what they think is, well, because I have done wrongs, I might not earn salvation after death. So the good works, the buying of the tickets to heaven and the indulgences was one way that people were coping with that issue, by the way. But Martin Luther was now questioning the issue of tickets to heaven and indulgences. I mean, he was really now, thinking that there's something wrong with that. Selling tickets to heaven, that somebody else can actually take care of your soul, that somebody else can actually intercede with the divine, so your soul can go to heaven after death, regardless of your behavior on earth, regardless. So he was just tormented. He was one of those individuals that he couldn't sleep again at night, just thinking about that. How is it that our souls goes to heaven? And so he felt from within himself that he was not ready, that he was not doing what was proper, what Christ had taught during his lifetime, that there was something missing, in other words, that he didn't feel worthy. That when he died, he said, if I happen to die at this point, I don't think that I'm actually going to go to heaven, because again of perhaps the way he felt about his own life or himself, etc. So he didn't feel that inner peace to say, yes, I feel that I'm actually going to be worthy, a candidate again to go to heaven. So he started really now studying the Bible, and he wanted to find clues or answers about what Christ actually said about the subject. In other words, what did he say about this? So it is here that Martin Luther arrived to the conclusion by studying the teachings of Christ. So he studied the New Testament in this case. Okay, so he's now going to delve into those books that talk about the life and teachings and the crucifixion of Christ. And he's going to be now looking for those clues as to, what actually he said about the issue of salvation. And it is here that Martin Luther is going to arrive to the conclusion that there was never any talk about indulgences or tickets to heaven during what he believed to be, again, the original teachings, the original guidance, the spiritual guidance of Christ, that he did not find any reference that the church or anybody for that matter could actually save somebody else. Okay? Especially when somebody is going to be donating monies or doing charity or good works. Christ never really talked about good works, he said. Okay, so instead, Martin Luther is going to find references that what Christ was actually talking about here as to how a person is able to go to heaven is one of purification, that is to say. Okay, somebody's purifying oneself from all worldly attachments. Okay, there's references about, again, people being attached to treasure, to money and wealth, and being unable to go to heaven, for example, because of the attachment it creates. Particularly when we become so attached to material things and so on and so forth, we're unable to reach the spiritual plane again. So he's finding reference to that, but ultimately what Martin Luther is now looking at in the teachings of Christ is that salvation is really an individual journey. In other words, nobody else is going to do the work for you, but the individual has to be responsible for his or her own spiritual salvation. So there's not a reference of somebody actually paying monies and somebody else doing the salvation for you, but rather that the individual has to be responsible for the purification process. That is to say, you have to purify yourself. In other words, you have to renounce or detach yourself from, worldly attachments and material attachments and so on and so forth. And ultimately, through that purification, what Martin Luther is suggesting is that the individual is going to attain a state of grace, that is to say. So again, this is what his central message about salvation was all about. Again, salvation by grace, not salvation by good works. In other words, you're not going to save your soul by doing good works, like charity or helping others, which is very good. Helping others, helping the sick, and all that. All of that, again, is good works. But that's not ultimately what is going to save your soul. Okay? Because you can continue to be attached to the world. You can continue to have, attachments to worldly possessions or material experiences, pleasures, while continuing to do the good works. So that's not going to change the quality of your soul. That is to say, you're probably not going to remain pretty much, in the same place. So what salvation by grace is that when a person's attain the state of grace, is when there's a process of purification that reaches a certain level in which you attain what today we call simply sainthood. That is to say, that is what grace is. Okay? So in other words, you purify yourself just enough, okay? And you raise, if you will, the quality of your soul to the state of a saint, okay? So sainthood, that is to say. So you have to undergo certain purification, which that means that you need to take up some spiritual disciplines, that is to say, in order to achieve that. So spiritual disciplines can be, can vary from prayer, from fasting, studying the Bible, attending the church, church activities of various kinds, or again, everything that is considered to be spiritual activity, if you will. That is a kind of practice, that is a kind of discipline that is going to change the state of your spiritual state. Again, from one that is totally immersed in matter and totally attached to material possessions and material pleasures and so on, to one that is completely free of that. And so you're able to reach the plane of the saints, if you will. So once you reach the sainthood in this life, then you can transfer your soul to heaven. Because what he says is that, well, heaven is really filled with people that were very spiritual here on earth, truly spiritual, not just doing good works, but rather people that were just like Christ-like, if you will, okay, Christ-like, okay, so like saints and so on and so forth, very similar to that, okay. So you have to pretty much attain that state here in this earth in order to actually gain salvation. That's what, in very general terms, he calls, again, salvation by grace. So there's indulgences, of course, are not going to do it, because you have to do it yourself. This is what he calls individual responsibility. So the individual has to be responsible. The individual has to practice, again, on a daily basis, the spiritual disciplines. Okay, that's the only way you're going to change the state, within yourself. So again, it places all the responsibility on the individual, okay, on the individual, and not on any institutions. In other words, to attain salvation, you don't even need a church. That's what he's actually saying. So it was very radical. It's a very radical message, because it's not just that you don't need anybody else, you don't need the priest, but you also don't need the church itself. So, this idea that the church was the mediator between God and humans, what Martin Luther is saying, that's not the case, because the individual can have a personal, immediate, direct connection with the divine, with God, in other words. So any individual. So we don't need a mediator, okay? We can actually do it ourselves. In other words, that's what he's actually saying. It's a very revolutionary, very radical concept at a time in which there was, of course, a well-established church that said, no, I mean, it's really the church that was placed on earth by the disciples of Christ in order to guide people to heaven, and there's no other way for people to go to heaven other than going through the church. So what Martin Luther is saying is just removing the church itself, okay, from the connection between humans and God, and that humans can actually tap into the divine directly. They can read the Bible on their own, they can study it, they can be inspired by it, they can receive wisdom, and so on and so forth, as opposed to be receiving that from another person, that is to say. So again, this is something that is going to change the course of history, because Martin Luther will be the forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther is the father of the Protestant Reformation. He's the forerunner of this religious revolution that is about to unfold. That is going to have repercussions not only all over Europe, but all over the world, and particularly in the formation of the religious colonies of North America that the British established, by the way. Okay, so even the founding of the United States back in the colonial period go back to this process that I'm actually talking about, the Protestant Reformation. All right, so what he proposed, again, is a series. Let me go back. He proposed 95 reforms, and the 95 theses, as he called it. Okay, Martin Luther proposed 95 areas within the church doctrine, within the church practices, so on, that needed to be reformed in order for the church to resemble as closely as possible to the kind of teachings that Christ actually gave to the disciples. And so, of course, he was very hesitant about publishing those 95 theses or 95 reform proposals. But again, ultimately, he's going to go ahead and do it as a result of he had an experience during this time in which he was almost struck by lightning. He was almost killed by lightning as he was actually going through a forest, running away from the rain, etc. And he actually saw a lightning struck a tree and pretty much burning it up instantaneously. And so he saw that as a sign again of God, that he needed to actually go ahead and publish the thesis. He does. And of course, just the thought itself that he could have died again from that lightning also made him think or reflect upon his own death. What would have happened to me if I would have died in that moment? Would have been going to heaven, meet the Creator, or going to hell? So again, he was also tormented by that thought. So he goes ahead and actually goes and nails those 95 theses on a local church. He actually goes to the local church and nails those 95 theses. So the parishioner, the priest, the local priest, can actually read them. And of course, this is his way of protesting again against his own institution. Again, so he's actually protesting against the church itself. And of course, here he's talking about salvation by grace, everything I just explained, that people need to be responsible, that people need to do those spiritual disciplines. He's rejecting tickets to heaven, indulgences, selling indulgences, which he's very critical of. He wants for the church to stop the selling of indulgences, for example. He's proposing to translate the Bible into all of the other languages of the earth. not just to the German, but he's proposing to translate the Bible into French, into English, into Spanish, all of the languages of Europe and beyond. So people can actually read the Bible in the language that they were raised and that they can understand, in other words, in the local languages. So that's another thing. Again, another of those reforms. So I'm not going to here talk about those 95 theses, except the most important ones, like the stop selling indulgences, the translation of the Bible into all the other languages, the removal of the saints and the relics. So he's very critical of the cult of the saints. Okay, so he's wanting to remove from the church all of the imagery, again, of saints and virgins and the relics, again, of the church, and to have Christ in the very center of the church itself. And perhaps as the only image, but he's very critical of images just in general. So again, so he's very critical in that what he's actually critical of is that for many people, the figure of Christ had become secondary, that is to say. So the saints and the virgins had become primary. So he wanted kind of to reverse that, have Christ at the very center, just because he's trying to return to original Christianity. And also the removal of the church hierarchy, that is to say, so the removal of all of the church administrators, that we really don't need, again, a priest. We don't need a mediator, somebody who is going to stand between ourselves and God. And so we don't need the church personnel, that is to say. So he's not really suggesting to have a church without any type of ministers or somebody that is going to actually deliver mass or maybe a sermon, etc. What he's actually referring is that those ministers are not going to be the ones mediating our salvation. In other words, that we just don't have to resort to them in order to find some form of spiritual connection with God, that is to say. So he wants to remove the church hierarchy. And in fact, he says that we don't need a church in general, but if we are going to have one, I mean, that anybody can just go up again and provide a sermon. If the person has sufficient knowledge of the Bible, it can be anybody coming from the congregation that has studied the Bible, and they can actually perhaps be ordained as ministers or pastors, etc. And they can actually just provide some guidance, provide a sermon on some teachings. But that's exactly what it is. Again, it's just a sermon, it's just a teaching that is being explained, but not somebody that is mediating between God and ourselves, in other words. So he wants to do it away with us. Of course, this is not going to be welcomed with open arms. The 95 Theses shook the European world, in that the church itself was alarmed. This was a scandal. Martin Luther, of course, had to actually run for his life because the church ordered for his arrest. Of course, during this time, anybody questioning the church was considered to be a heretic, perhaps a person that was influenced by the devil, and so on. So there were, criminal charges that the church had for such individuals, and they faced persecution very often, and often, of course, execution as well, and of course, death. So he had to flee, and he had to take refuge on the kingdom, one of the kingdoms, again, of Germany, ruled by Frederick II. So Frederick II was the king, the ruler, the prince that is going to shelter Martin Luther for a while, to save them from persecution. And of course, what Frederick II, this German prince or ruler, is going to do is also follow Martin Luther and break away from the Church of Rome and turn his kingdom to be Protestant. Okay, Protestant, that is to say. And one of the reasons, again, he's going to do that is because he's trying to save money, again, save taxes. He doesn't want to pay taxes to Rome. So he is going to break away from the Catholic Church and now allow for Martin Luther and his followers to actually disseminate the teachings of Luther and endorse Luther's teachings, Protestant teachings, if you will, Protestant Christianity. So the Protestant Reformation begins. So again, the nailing of those 95 theses started out, again, a process that in European history and in world history is called the Protestant Reformation. Okay, the Protestant Reformation begins because as Luther steps out of the church in protest, and he's kicked out, by the way, of the church, there's going to be a lot of people that would follow him. Okay, a lot of people in Central Europe, particularly in Germany, are going to follow him in great numbers, leave the church as well, and trying to form what they believed to be was the original Christian church, that is to say. And so Martin Luther was the forerunner of this process, again, of trying to reform the church, stepping outside of the church, forming their own congregation, Protestant denomination or Protestant congregation. And after Luther, there will be others that are going to do the same thing. They're going to step outside of the church. They're going to take some of the ideas of Luther, but then they're going to actually add some of theirs and also create their own branch of Protestantism, if you will. So there will be so many different Protestant denominations rising in the coming centuries from Martin Luther's original protest of those 95 theses. There will be others that are also going to be following suit. So again, in the Protestant Reformation, what we see is European rulers breaking away from the Roman Church. I just mentioned Frederick II. He was one of them. And the motivation of many of the rulers is not necessarily religious. In other words, it's not like those rulers are very devout to their faith and their religion, that they're in a search for the original teachings of Christ, and so they want to reform Christianity. They might have certain elements of that present in them, but for the most part, what motivates them is freeing themselves from the burdens of taxes that every year they must pay to Rome, the church in Rome. So they don't want that, in other words. So one strategy is simply going Protestant. If I go Protestant, I will no longer be tied to the church of Rome, so I don't have to pay taxes. Okay? So I'm just going to create my own Protestant church, and I'm going to lead it here in my kingdom, and, there will be no more, again, revenues collected from me, no taxes, and so on. Okay? So, again, there was a sort of material, monetary aspect that was also driving rulers in the Protestant Reformation in Europe. I just mentioned Frederick II. There will be others that for personal reasons are going to do the same thing, like Henry VIII, the King of England, who's also going to break away from the Church of Rome for personal reasons, particularly when he wanted to have a divorce. Under the Catholic Church, he couldn't. And so because he really wanted to remarry and divorce his wife, he saw in the Protestant Reformation a strategy. And well, if I go Protestant, okay, if I break from the Church of Rome and I create my own Protestant church, in my church, divorce will be allowed. Okay? So there's a personal reason. So we're going to see again that rulers are going to be breaking away from the Church of Rome for their own private personal interest that might not be all motivated by really, the drive, the passion, the devotion to find the true teachings of Christ. So again, this is one aspect of the Protestant Reformation. The other, of course, is the rise of the Protestant denominations in Europe. Once again, people living in great numbers, following Luther and following other reformers in creating their own denominations, because they also saw, in a certain sense, a state of decay and degeneration, if you will, in Europe. A social decay, that is to say. In other words, they saw the need to reform Christianity because they also were trying to find the meaning of salvation. What is salvation? Maybe what the Protestants are offering. Maybe that's the way, that's the path. Maybe they have a certain set of teachings or certain disciplines that are going to help me out attain salvation. And of course, because they saw society so disintegrated in decay, they saw that maybe this is the answer, for that maybe we need to reform Christianity so we can actually as well, reform our personal lives, find some inner peace, some connection with the divine. And so again, we're going to see people now moving out of the church and creating their own Protestant denominations. Martin Luther created the first, called the Lutherans, as they were called, the Lutherans, but out of that there will be others also emerging in the 1600s and beyond, by the way. So the third, of course, aspect of the Protestant Reformation, it's that the Protestant Reformation also moved a lot of those Protestants to become social reformers. Just because they saw society in decay, as I mentioned, they saw the need to spread Protestantism across Europe and go to their neighbors, go into their own communities, and trying to actually convert people to their Protestant faith, believing that as more people will convert to Protestantism, they'll be reformed. In other words, we can actually reform our towns, we can reform our cities, that there will be less alcoholism, there will be less poverty, less prostitution, less social ills in general. So Protestantism is going to actually make people actually practice the faith. In other words, that you have to renounce, once again, to those worldly attachments and pleasures, and to renounce to drinking, renounce to drinking, renounce to the pleasures, the worldly pleasures of this world in every possible way that people were actually experiencing. Give up those tickets to heaven, the indulgence. In other words, stop indulging again in the world, and trying to take individual responsibility for your own salvation. This is what the Protestants are offering. So the idea behind it is that through this process, as more and more people are converted, then European civilization, European society in general, is going to be reformed. Okay, is going to go back, to actually stay in track as to how people should live, how people should live in a kind of moral way, that they're going to actually, live a righteous life of purification, live within their own family, sustaining them, and guiding their families and their communities to heaven, and so on. So they wanted to reform, actually, European societies. So they were, again, going out, they were very active, if you will, trying to gain converts and so on and so forth. But as the point number 4 actually indicates, is that over time, many of those social reformers are going to find it very difficult, even for themselves, to stay on track when they're so surrounded by those old ways, in that, again, there's still a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, a lot of alcohol, and so on, and vices, the vices of the city, and so on, again, violence, and so on. So it was very difficult to leave the ways of the past by continuing to live in the same environment. So you want to purify yourself, you want to change yourself, you want to detach from everything that you were attached in the past. But if you continue to be in that same environment, it's going to be very hard. So in many cases, people are going to retreat and actually try to create their own Protestant communities somewhere else, okay, outside of the mainstream. Towns outside of the mainstream, cities, buy land somewhere else and trying to build their own communities. So the people that practice the same religion, the Protestant religion in this case, whether they were Lutherans or others, that they can reinforce amongst themselves the doctrine, the teachings, the discipline, so they can all help each other, in other words. So again, this is going to lead to the rise of Protestant communities all over Europe. Again, communities that were outside of the mainstream, by the way, because there's just so much license, if you will, in the cities and the towns in which people were just leading, lives of what they call, sin, for example. That people had to just find a separate existence, a separate community that they can actually practice their religion in private without being so much attracted or seduced by the temptations of the city, if you will. So they wanted to create cities of God, in other words, ideal communities. Protestants wanted to really build, ideal communities in which they will actually be practicing their own religion in private and helping the future generations continue that faith without being so much lured or seduced by the old ways of Europe, in other words. So this is another phenomenon of the Protestant Reformation. Again, it's not just that rulers were breaking away from the Church of Rome and that there were people forming their own independent Protestant congregations, Protestant religions, if you will, but they're also in charge of trying to reform European society and also creating their own independent community. So this is really an aspect of the Protestant Reformation that helps explain the formation of those colonies I just explained in North America, because in due course what the Protestants in Europe, particularly in England, are going to feel is that they really wanted to create communities elsewhere outside of Europe. They just felt that Europe was too much. It was too intense, and there was a lot of persecution, a lot of strife, a lot of conflict between religions, a lot of fighting taking place, that they just wanted to escape Europe altogether and go to a new land across the Atlantic in North America and create their cities of God, that is to say. So again, there's a connection here that people were in search of those cities of God to really build a godly city, again, a Protestant community that will be godly in the eyes of God, that will be the ideal existence for human beings, in which the people living there were going to become candidates for heaven, that is to say. Just checking the time here. Okay, we got good time. All right, so even the colonies that will be established in North America, again, were established under that idea, that notion that the settlers were really looking for the promised land that God had reserved for them in order to restart humanity, to reset it in a way that this is the way that people should live, and this is the kind of Christianity that Christ intended for people to actually practice, in other words. Okay? Now, let us talk about the Puritans, because they're going to be instrumental, of course, in this process of colonization. And they're going to be the forerunners, by the way, of religious colonization, so to speak, in North America by Great Britain or England at this time in the early 1600s, establishing a series of colonies, particularly in places like we call New England. So let's talk about the Puritans and some of their main ideas and how they're going to serve in this process of colonization, and what will be the greatest contributions, again, of the Puritans in the formation of the kind of culture, the cultural ideas, again, that are so essential for understanding the United States today. By the way, I'm sorry. So the origin of the Puritans, well, was a French minister by the name of John Calvin. And he initially started out, again, as a follower of Luther. So he was, if you will, one of the first individuals who paid attention to this development that I just explained of Martin Luther leaving the church in Central Europe, in Germany, for example. And he was one of those individuals that was paying attention to that development, that crisis. And he's going to be one of the individuals that is going to also follow suit. In other words, agree with Luther that reform was necessary for Christianity to return to the original version, the original teachings of Christ. But most importantly, John Calvin also agreed with the ideas of Luther as to how to attain that. So the idea of purification, okay? The idea of purification. So therefore, he's going to start his own branch of Protestantism called the Puritans. You know, the people that live lives of purity, okay? Purification. That's the whole intent, again, of the Puritans. That is to say, is that the followers of John Calvin are actually people that are engaged in the spiritual disciplines of various kinds and trying to actually purify themselves to attain the state of grace and so on and so forth. However, John Calvin, over time, is going to also depart from the ideas of Luther and pretty much develop his own interpretation of Christianity in how people actually attain salvation. That is going to be distinct and very different from the kind of teachings and interpretation that Luther actually initiated, by the way. So, once again, we see the splintering again of the Protestants because, you know, Protestant denominations splinter every time a leader or a group of people create a different interpretation or believe that they have, you know, a strategy as to how people go to heaven, in other words, okay, how people get saved, in other words. So this is, again, what happened to John Calvin, is that over time, even though he agreed in many ways with what Luther had said, he's going to add on to some of Luther's ideas his own, and so therefore he was no longer a Lutheran, and he's going to actually create his own branch of Protestantism that we know as the Puritans. And Puritanism in general, it's not, you know, the Lutheran Church anymore. This is not Protestant Lutherans, but rather Protestant Puritans. Again, you know, this is a different branch. So again, what he's actually indicating is that, again, and this is his own interpretation, by the way. Calvin's own interpretation is that in regards to salvation, he believed that not everybody was going to make it to heaven. That's his personal belief, by the way. Okay, this is not Luther's interpretation or anybody else's. This is Calvin's, okay, own interpretation. So he believed that there was only going to be a select group of people that will end up actually going to heaven. He called them the chosen ones, okay? And the chosen ones. This is going to be a minority, a group of people that are the elect or the selected ones, the chosen ones that are going to actually make it. Well, the rest are not, he said, okay? I'm just quoting what he said, by the way. This is not reflecting my own, you know, views or anything like that. So, what Calvin suggested is that this is the way he believed God had organized, again, the divine plan. That he had a divine plan when the world was created, when he created the world, he created the universe, and so on and so forth. And all of the souls were created in the beginning of time. And so there, he had a divine plan. And he said, this is how creation is going to unfold. and this is how everything is going to end. So he believed that God knew everything, even how everything was going to end, in terms of the souls that were going to actually earn salvation versus those that were not. In other words, that he already knew ever since, because there was a divine plan. In other words, he called this predestination. In other words, everything is already written. It's predestined. In other words, ever since the beginning, God pretty much planned it all. It's a divine plan, so it's predestined. In other words, it's written, it's set in stone, and we're just here to kind of play out that plan, to act it out, if you will. So again, so his followers asked him, so how do we know if we are part of the chosen ones? How can we tell if we are part of the chosen ones, or who is part of the chosen, group that will go to heaven? So again, John Calvin, once again, on his own, he's pretty much making up, if you will, an answer for that. That is going to be the foundation of the Puritan religion that he's creating here. And that is, he said, well, one of the signs, again, that you can tell if people are going to be saved or not, if they're chosen ones, is that if they're, Puritans. What he means is that if they are purifying, if they are conducting a life of purity, if they're purifying themselves. So look at their behavior, okay, it's very important. Okay, if they're not engaged in worldly, indulgences and so on, they're not indulging in the world, in vices and pleasures, but rather that they're living a life of purification, that's one sign. But he actually come up with another sign, and that is economic success. In other words, he believed that the quality of your life here in this world also was a sign of God that will tell people whether they were going to go to heaven or not. So he said, if you see people that are suffering, okay, and that they're economically, deprived, they don't have anything to eat, they're constantly struggling and so on, that they're poor, that they're suffering from material lacks of all kinds and so on. Well, again, Calvin said, once again, that he believed that those were signs that God was sending you, okay, that the afterlife for you was going to be a life of torment. Okay, so in other words, the quality of life, the kind of life that one has in this world, was only a mirror of the afterlife. So if you are well off, okay, if you don't have those material hardships or, those material lacks, you're not economically deprived, that you're well off and so on, he believed that was a sign that you were part of the chosen one, so therefore in the afterlife you were going to heaven. This is the place where you're going to go. So you're being told that because you're living a kind of heaven on earth, in other words. So you're experiencing a kind of heavenly existence on earth, the kind of existence that you're going to actually enjoy in the afterlife. So again, this is his own interpretation. So economic success actually for him was a sign of salvation, that those that were economically successful were really the chosen ones. Those were the people that God has elected or selected again to go to heaven. Because look, they're being blessed. In other words, they're not suffering, so therefore they're kind of the privileged children of God, in other words. So again, this is his own interpretation. This has nothing to do with original Christianity. If you look at the life of Christ, for example, again, he's not, living a life of opulence or of glamour or anything like that. Of course, very humble, individual, by the way, from humble origins and so on and so forth, who pretty much renounced to all of the worldly possessions and wealth and so on from that this world had to offer, by the way. So again, this is not something that he's actually reading from the Bible and said, oh, I have a right to the interpretation of Christ in which he's actually saying this, but rather this is his own conclusion. Again, it's coming out of his own conclusion, from his own mind, that is to say. But it was very appealing to people that actually were very industrious, perhaps, people that worked very hard and tried to create a kind of affluent society. It appealed to them, by the way, because it provided a justification that if you work very hard and if you create an affluent society, a society of affluence in which there's not going to be any lacks, any material deprivations of any kind, that people felt chosen, people felt blessed, by the kind of world that people could create through their hard work. So the Puritans were very hard workers because they believed that this is the way we get saved. One way that we prove that we are the chosen ones is that we have to wake up in the morning every day and work very hard in order to transform our societies, in order to create enterprises, in order to create work that is going to create affluence in our lives, individually, in families, and as the community as a whole. And the more affluence we create through our hard work, so we have to be very diligent, very disciplined, then this affluence is going to convince us, it is going to convince others that we are the chosen ones because God has blessed us. Look at how we live. We don't suffer deprivations of any kind. We're not deprived of anything, from food to clothing, shelter, or nothing. We live okay, so therefore we feel uplifted. We feel blessed, in other words. So the Puritans are going to develop an ethic of work. A work for the Puritans was seen as a religious duty. Okay, for the Puritans, work was not just something that people did in order to survive, but they did that in order to save their souls. Because through hard work, you were going to uplift yourself economically. And by uplifting yourself economically, people felt inspired that, look, all this success I'm attaining through my work, I see that as a blessing of God. That God is telling me you are going to heaven. You are part of the chosen ones. Because you're now creating a heaven on earth. So we have to create a society that is so affluent, in other words, so well off, that is going to bring us the sense that we are actually the chosen ones, in other words. So again, this has created what is called the spirit of capitalism. Okay, and the Puritans, according to the sociologist Max Weber, okay, who lived in the late 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. Max Weber, the sociologist, Max Weber really points out that before there was capitalism in Europe, capitalism is going to flourish as an economic system in the 1700s, even though we see early traces of that in the 1600s, by the way, like the idea of private property, for example, etc. So what Max Weber is saying is that before there was capitalism, the Puritans actually started capitalism by the Puritan religion, when they introduced the idea that economic success and hard work, in order, the two elements that can actually create affluence, that those were actually necessary elements for salvation. So Max Weber is saying that capitalism actually started out as a religion. It started out with the Puritans as a religious belief that only those that have economic success are going to go to heaven. So therefore we get to work. We have to get to work in order to save our souls. Okay, work very hard to create a heavenly society, society of affluence that can actually tell others that we're the chosen ones. So this religion, over time, became an economic system. Over time, that's what Max Weber said. So the significance of this is that when the Puritans are going to come to North America in the 1620s and 1630s and beyond to establish New England, places like Plymouth or Massachusetts, etc., they're going to bring with them the spirit of capitalism. So it's not just that Protestantism is going to come to North America, to New England, to establish those British colonies that will become the backbone, if you will, of later on the United States, if you will, but rather that also they introduce capitalism itself. that the origins of capitalism came with the Puritans again, and capitalism will become the dominant, of course, economic system of the United States. And again, Max Weber is suggesting that this came with, of course, the Puritans. Okay, so we got about 5 minutes. All right, so again, so what we see here is that the Puritans were in search for the promised land, okay, and they wanted to create such kind of society, okay. So they tried it in France. They tried to create a Puritan community, a city of God that will be very prosperous, very affluent. But they faced persecution from, the Catholic kings of France, and often they had to be, of course, driven out of France. And we're going to see Calvin, of course, and the Puritans stepping out of France, and they're going to go to Switzerland for a time. They're also trying to establish their communities there. They're looking for the promised land. But they're going to look at Holland as perhaps the place in which they're going to be able to successfully establish this affluent community, the city of God, this earthly paradise, that is to say. They're truly convinced, by the way, that there's a piece of land somewhere waiting for them that God had reserved for them to build this earthly paradise, that is to say. So they turned to Holland again in the 1530s because Holland was very prosperous. Again, there's merchants in Holland that are beginning to participate in trade and so on, and it will become one of the leading trading empires, at least briefly, in the latter part of the 1500s and 1600s. By the way, so they see Holland as moving very fast towards this very affluent kind of economic system, if you will. Plus, it was very open-minded. Okay, it was full of free thinkers. There's not going to be the kind of persecution that existed elsewhere. Okay, so they say we're not going to face persecution. It's a very open-minded society, very prosperous, and so on. So maybe this is the place. So they're going to be moving their communities, and they're going to be establishing communities in Holland in the 1530s, and they're going to continue building their communities until the 1560s and perhaps a little bit later. But they're also going to give up their thoughts on Holland, because what they saw in Holland, once they arrived to Holland, is that they perceived Dutch society, the Dutch of Holland, as to be very liberal, perhaps too much, in that there was a lot of drinking going on in the towns, in the ports, for example, and that there was, the relationships between men and women were just way too liberal, way too loose. There was prostitution taking place, and so on and so forth. So what the Puritans believe in, even though they're living separately, they have their own land, apart from their own the Dutch towns and so on. They believe that over time, the future generation of Puritans were going to be seduced. In other words, that our children, grandchildren, and their grandchildren, again down the road, are simply going to become very Dutch-like. They're going to actually be absorbed into the Dutch culture, which is very, very liberal, and this is going to end the project of creating this earthly paradise that is Puritan, and we're the chosen ones. So they turn now their attention, of course, to another kingdom to the north of Holland, and that is England. By the 1560s, of course, the Puritans are beginning now to move their communities into England, because England turned Protestant back in the 1530s, when King Henry VIII actually broke away from the Church of Rome, because King Henry VIII wanted to obtain a divorce. He wanted to divorce his present wife in order to remarry. And so because of those personal reasons, he decided that he was going to break from the Church of Rome and go Protestant. And so what is going to happen again is that, again, let me write it here. King Henry VIII The English king, once again, went ahead and created his own Protestant church, which he called the Anglican Church. By the way, the Anglican Church, and in this so-called Protestant church, the king was actually the head of the church, the king himself. In other words, the leader, the head, the ruler, the person that is going to be actually dictating the kind of teachings, the doctrine itself, is going to be the king. And so in this church, King Henry VIII legalized divorce. Okay, so you can divorce in the Anglican Church. So on the surface, this seems like England was going Protestant because it was no longer Catholic, because King Henry VIII had actually broke relations with the Church of Rome. But when the Puritans are arriving now, again, by the 1560s, 1570s, and thereafter, what they're finding out as they're establishing their independent communities in England, because they believed England was the promised land, by the way, what they're finding out is that this Anglican Church was identical to the Catholic Church in everything except a few things. It was identical. It was the same church hierarchy. Again, the same ranking of administrators, again, of priests, for example, and bishops. They haven't even had a pope, by the way, but the pope was subordinated to the king, of England, to the monarchy. So it had an English pope that was supposed to be the head of the church, but it was not really the head of the church, because above the English pope of the Anglican Church was the monarchy. Okay, so it was the same thing. It was, again, the cult of the saints, the cult of, the virgins was still there, mass, it was the same procedure, the same sacraments. Everything was exactly the same, okay, except that it was not named Catholic and that it was not connected to Rome. And now that the king is the leader, and of course you can actually divorce within the Anglican Church. So the Puritans, instead of just living their own independent, separate lives in England, are going to take on the challenge to try to reform English society, and they also want to reform the Anglican Church and make it as Protestant as possible, that is to say. So they're going to get involved in the kind of affairs, if you will, of England in trying to reform the church. So therefore, they're going to have a tough time when in 1603 we're going to see a new royal family, the Stuarts, coming into England to rule England after 1603. And the Stuart kings, it's called the Stuarts, this royal family was very Catholic. Okay, so Catholic kings are now coming to rule England after 1603. And this spelled disaster for the Puritans, because what the Stuart kings want is for England to return to Catholicism. They want England to restore relationships with Rome, that is to say. So they're going to now try to persecute Protestants, whether they were Lutherans, whether they were Puritans, or others, again, that were not part of the Catholic Church. They're going to be now persecuting them, of course. So the Puritans, of course, are going to be persecuted, and the Puritans are going to kind of separate into two groups. One is the Puritans that want to stay in England, facing the persecution, facing all of the challenges that are presented to them by the Stuart kings and the Orthodox Puritans, if you will. But there's another group of Puritans called the Separatists. And the Separatists are people who are giving up on England. They're giving up on the promised land in England, and they want to now take a pilgrimage. They want to become pilgrims and kind of search for the promised land. They want to go travel the world, perhaps in the Atlantic Ocean, across the Atlantic Ocean, the New World, because they believe that England is not the promised land. The fact that now we have Catholic kings, they said, and they're persecuting the Puritans, maybe this is a sign of God that we should leave that we should separate. In other words, we should separate from England, we should separate from Europe, okay, and pretty much find the promised land elsewhere. And this is again how the separatists are going to be the pioneers again of colonization in North America. They're going to be known as the Pilgrims because they're on a pilgrimage to find the promised land, and they're going to establish the first series of colonies in the New World. Okay, so here we make a stop again of our second session. So when we come back, we're going to see the process of colonization itself, okay, of New England, but also the Quakers moving into Pennsylvania, and also the creation of a Catholic colony in Maryland as well when we come back in session 3. That's all I have for you. So I'll see you in session 3. Goodbye.